Today's episode of Two Guys Hike Up a Creek follows along as Wietze and I chase the lofty and elusive summits of Bonnet and Hickson Peak over Badger Pass in Banff National Park. Our route took us 22 kilometers up Johnston Creek with 800 meters of height gain and 200 meters of height lost before finally arriving at the remote JO29 campsite. After spending the night, we hiked up to Badger Pass before ascending a high call under the south peak of Bonnet. After taking both the main summit and the lower south one, we exited back to Badger Pass and finally down to an alpine valley granting access to Hickson's southwest ridge. After ascending Hickson, we returned to camp and were chased all the way back to the trailhead by billions of relentless mosquitoes to cap off a 48-kilometer, 2,200-meter height gain day in the Rockies. Wietze and I left the Johnson Creek trailhead at around 1400 hours and started our 22-kilometer trek to campsite JO29. We'd left late on purpose, hoping to get to camp in time for a quick supper and then bed before an early start the following day. Within 10 minutes of the parking lot, I wondered if we'd underestimated the mosquito problem. They were horrible, and this was in light forest on a good trail. We donned bug spray and continued on as I watched a dozen bugs land on Wietze's shirt ahead of me, despite the repellent. The ink pots looked their usual tired selves as we hiked past the few remaining tourists on a Friday afternoon. What can I say about the hike up Johnson Creek from the ink pots towards JO29? It's meditative, it's long, it's both scenic and not very, it's in great shape or rough shape. Obviously, being one of the more popular trails in Banff, it is maintained and has bridges over most of its moving water. Long sections of the trek are in forest with roots, rocks, and more height gains and losses than you'd think necessary. If that all sounds negative, it both is and it isn't. Confused? So are we. To judge the trail a little more fairly, it's a great backpacking trek with water along the way, more than a few campgrounds to stay at, and plenty of open spaces to enjoy the tranquility of the Rockies. As an approach trail to simply get somewhere else, presumably a nicer place, it's not much more than a long grind. As much as I love walking, I would prefer if at least half the distance could be biked on this one. A factor that didn't make things more enjoyable for me on this trip was a relentless summer cough and a bruised rib. Don't ask. The rib issue was especially problematic with an overnight pack that was much heavier than I preferred, with 2 nights' food, ice axe, and crampons. Honestly, the pain was so bad at times that over the next 24 to 36 hours, I felt like vomiting every time the camera bumped into my side. It took us 5 hours, but finally at around 7 p.m. we crossed the last boggy meadow and walked into Camp JO29. This is where the situation deteriorated dramatically. The mosquitoes at camp were predictably horrid. They were honestly really bad. I've done my share of trips with bugs, including canoe trips to northern areas of Canada where you expect the mozzies to be terrible. This was even worse than that somehow.
This way. I assume 29 is the top. 500 meters. I don't know, man. And you have to wonder, where did that horse come from? We didn't see evidence of horses anywhere.
We quickly choked down some supper in a cloud of biting insects and tried to enjoy a warm bevy, but the bugs were honestly so bad we bailed into the tent by 8 p.m. in preparation of an early start the following day. Wietze promptly fell asleep, but Dreamland avoided me for at least another 2 hours. My rib hurt to lie on, and I struggled not to cough, only making things worse. The tight confines of my sleeping bag didn't help any of my physical ailments. A mouse ran up the side of our tent and I had to flick it off, which I found kind of nasty. At around 8:30 it started pouring small ice pellets, which piled up around the tent at least an inch deep. This camp was not proving friendly. A miserable evening was followed by an even worse night. I finally fell asleep sometime around 11 p.m. At 0300 I was wakened by a freezing cold Wietze trying to don some additional clothing. On waking, my cough started up again. Oh, joy. After tossing and turning for an hour, I gave up and told Wietze I was getting up. There was no point trying to sleep anymore, and we might as well start our day by headlamp. What a flustercluck. Not every trip is rainbows and unicorns, folks. After a quick morning brew, we readied our day packs and headed out of camp by headlamp at 0500. The ground was wet and slick, with some of the previous evening's ice pellets still unmelted as we started back along the Johnston Creek Trail to the Badger Pass Trail junction. As the sun rose on Pulsatilla Mountain's east face behind us, we slowly made our way up the Badger Pass Trail, arriving at the pass just under 2 hours from camp. From the pass, the rest of the route was very obvious. We could clearly see the south peak of Bonnet and the high call that granted access to the hidden glacier beyond. After circumventing a rock-hard patch of snow just below the pass, we made our way up the Moonscape Valley towards an obvious path in scree to the call high above.
Well, it's not looking so bad now anymore.
No, it doesn't look as steep either. It doesn't look as high.
I know. Because a couple hundred meters ago, I was like, oh man.
From the call, the route to our main objective looked very straightforward, bringing our tired spirits up a notch. One of the things we debated about before the trip was whether or not to bring a rope for the glacier travel. Obviously your mileage may vary, but we decided not to. Given it was August, we assumed that the crevasses would be obvious and the snowpack on the glacier should be minimal. The glacier gently abutted the face, which was a nice bonus, but as we stepped off the stable ice field, any doubts of the work ahead disappeared quick. This was going to be a bit of a grind. It took some effort, but in less than 55 minutes from the base, we were topping out on the west face scree ramp onto the scenic north ridge of Bonnet Peak. We were both feeling pretty darn good about our efforts so far as we slowly made our way up the easy north ridge of Bonnet. Views down the incredible east face stole the show as we hiked the last few meters to its lofty summit.
Summit of Bonnet Peak. Wow.
Summit views included Mount St. Bride, Douglas Lake, and the Valley of Hidden Lakes. Mount Drummond, McConnell, Halstead, Cuthead, Flints, Panther, Puma, Sierra, and the south summit of Bonnet.
A bit slow, but
Yeah, it's going to suck a bit.
The descent of the loose west face and back to the call went well, and by 10 o'clock we were already starting up our second summit of the day, up the easy west ridge of Bonnet Peak South. It only took us 45 minutes to ascend the easy west ridge of the South Peak, topping out at one of the largest summit cairns I've ever seen.
Bonnet South. Somebody's trying to make it as high as Big Bonnet. That's probably the biggest summit cairn I've ever seen.
The descent to the high call was quick and pleasant, and we took another break there, trying to warm up. Ironic that on a hot summer day we were spending most of it in toques and gloves. After ascending a short way to Badger Pass, we started descending the trail we'd come up only hours previous. I had mapped out a rough route into a valley south of the Hickson Call from the lower Badger Pass trail, but we were hoping to find a more efficient line that avoided unnecessary height loss and bushwhacking.
Gotta be good to be lucky, bud.
Thankfully, we found the perfect line into the South Valley off the trail, avoiding all bush and using slabs and alpine meadows to traverse into a little slice of Rockies heaven. Hickson Peak didn't look that easy from our vantage in the access valley. We could spot some troublesome drop-offs on the skyline ridge as it rose impressively above the call. No matter. In the Rockies, you never know how difficult something is from afar. You gotta get your nose right into it first. Wheatza led the way up a mix of dirt and scree, and soon we were at the col, staring up at the southwest ridge. Picking our way carefully up the slabs and ledges, we ascended easy to moderate terrain to rubble slopes under the summit.
Yeah, and now go in if you can. Yeah. Nicely done.
We followed a narrow ridge to the summit cairn where we finally saw our first register of the day, sitting pretty as you please 15 years after it was last touched by the ramblers.
Hickson, baby. Good job.
The views from Hickson included Noetic, Block, Helena Ridge, Castle, Pulsatilla, Victoria, Avens, and many, many more. I am not convinced that Hickson Peak is only 3,080 meters. I think it's well over 3,100 meters. The slabs back to the col were no problem on descent, and the hike out of the South Valley back to the Badger Pass Trail was pleasant in warm afternoon sun. What wasn't so pleasant was the idea that had been percolating all day. We were debating hiking back out today, rather than spending another uncomfortable night at camp. The issue with this idea was that the numbers were getting a bit ridiculous, especially considering my cough and rib issues and the fact that neither of us had slept very well. Hiking out today would mean a 48-kilometer day with 2,200 meters of total height gain. As we hiked into camp, all doubts vanished. The hordes of mosquitoes that greeted us like long-lost friends drove us instantly mad and made our decision to leave easy. The biting insects were stupid, honestly. There weren't only mozzies either. Huge horseflies were taking chunks out of us, even with tons of spray on. Wheatza's back looked like a battlefield after only 20 minutes of packing up camp. I'm not sure how to best describe the next 4.5 to 5 hours, honestly. It wasn't all bad. We were hiking through the Rockies. That's always a decent thing to be doing on a Saturday afternoon. But it hurt. As the minutes and hours ticked by agonizingly slow, it started to hurt worse and worse. Wheatza wasn't sure he had foot pads anymore, and I wanted to throw up from the pain in my ribs, especially when I started coughing every time we stopped. I've done quite a few of these types of death marches in the Rockies, and they're quite interesting when you disconnect yourself from the minute-to-minute suffering and turn your focus inwards. One interesting thing about death marches at the end of a long day is that it becomes about the time rather than the distance. We knew we had to hike about 22 kilometers out. The physics told us this would take between 4.5 and 5 hours. There was no way to avoid it and no way around it. That's what the math said, and that's what it took. Looking at the map and GPS didn't matter. It was the watch that became the cruel master of our march. I was very thankful when my iWatch finally died about an hour and a half left to go. I was finally completely free to focus on nothing at all. Life simplified. The ascent from the ink pot sucked big time as darkness closed in on us. We donned headlamps. Wheatza's decided it didn't feel like actually working, so he limped along in the dark, silent ahead of me. As we hiked the Johnston Creek Trail to the trailhead, time seemed to stand still and the mozzies took full advantage, coming at us out of the dark woods like Satan's little messengers of Urk. I hated those little bloodsuckers to the point of melancholy at this point. Eventually the math won as we stumbled into the parking lot. This was a trip that will not soon be forgotten, for all the right reasons and a few of the wrong ones. I suggest taking a little more time than we did to enjoy the long trek in and out, and pick a season with fewer biting insects than we had at camp. Bonnet and Hickson Peak make a wonderful duo of peaks that deserve much more attention from the summer and fall hiking and scrambling community.